It was the doll that waited. For 10 years, it sat in the suffocating heat of the Blackwood Pines Children's Home attic, a silent sentinel in a forgotten corner. Dust, as fine and soft as powdered bone, had settled over its faded calico dress and yarn hair, creating a shroud of neglect. The summer of 2005 was relentless, baking the old building until the very timbers groaned. But up here, time had stood still since November 1995. This space was not just a room. It was a monument to a story everyone thought they knew, a conclusion that had been accepted, filed away, and buried under a decade of institutional silence. But the doll remembered. It held its secret tightly, stitched into its very fabric, waiting for the right hands to finally unravel the lie. Catherine, the home's new director, saw the attic not as a tomb, but as a promise. Her mission was to scrub away the building's tarnished past and create a future, starting with this forgotten space. She envisioned a bright, airy playroom filled with laughter, a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet that now greeted her. Sunlight struggled through a single, grimy window, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and old cedar, the ghosts of countless childhoods packed away in cardboard boxes. Her plan was simple: clear out the old, make way for the new. She had no idea that in this forgotten repository of discarded memories, she was about to unearth a past that refused to stay buried, a tragedy that had been deliberately mislabeled and locked away. She almost missed it. Tucked behind a stack of water-stained ledgers, the doll was a small, forlorn shape in the gloom. Catherine reached for it, her fingers brushing away a thick layer of dust. It was heavier than it looked, solid and dense. One of its button eyes was missing, giving its stitched face a perpetually winking, almost conspiratorial expression. The fabric of its dress, once a cheerful pattern of tiny flowers, was now worn to a fragile thinness. This wasn't just a discarded toy. It felt like a relic, an object that had been cherished with a fierce, desperate love. Holding it, Catherine felt an unexpected pang of sorrow for the unknown child who had left it behind. It seemed impossible that such a treasured companion would be willingly abandoned. As the sound of children playing in the yard below drifted up through the floorboards, a fleeting image flickered in Catherine's mind, a ghost of a memory, not her own. 3 little girls, their faces bright with mischief, running down the main hallway. Their laughter was a silent echo, their movements a blur of vibrant life against the drab, institutional walls. They were inseparable, a trio bound by the shared experience of a life without parents. Emily, Sarah, and Jessica. The names surfaced from the old files she had reviewed upon taking the job. The 3 girls who, one cold November night in 1995, had simply vanished into thin air. The image was gone as quickly as it came, leaving Catherine alone in the dusty silence, the weight of the doll feeling heavier than ever. The attic seemed to press in on her, the silence now charged with unspoken questions. The official narrative was tidy, clinical, and devoid of emotion. 3 rebellious orphans, known for their elaborate games of make-believe, had planned an escape. The evidence cited was an open attic window and a crude rope fashioned from knotted bedsheets found on the ground below. A runaway. The case was closed within a week, the conclusion accepted without serious challenge. Blackwood Pines, under its former director, was eager to avoid a scandal, and the story of 3 troubled girls fleeing their difficult circumstances was the simplest, most convenient explanation. It was a story designed to be forgotten, a brief, sad chapter in the institution's long and complicated history. But the doll in Catherine's hands felt like a direct contradiction to that neat, clean story. It was a silent witness, a piece of evidence that had been overlooked in the hasty investigation. What child, in the midst of a desperate escape, would leave behind their most precious confidant? The doll's single button eyes seemed to bore into her, challenging the official version of events. It wasn't just an oversight. Its presence here felt deliberate, a clue left behind in a language no one had bothered to understand. It whispered of a different story, A darker truth that had been patiently waiting in the shadows for someone to finally listen. The dust, the silence, the forgotten toy. It all pointed to something far more sinister than three girls running away from home. Her original task of measuring the room for renovations was now completely forgotten. The doll had become the center of this dusty universe, a puzzle box she felt compelled to open. She ran her thumb over its torso, tracing the thick, clumsy stitches that ran down its abdomen. It was there she felt it again. A distinct lump, hard and rectangular, nestled deep within the cotton stuffing. It was unnatural, out of place. This wasn't a voice box or a simple repair. The stitching was a different color, a darker thread against the faded fabric, as if it had been added later in a hurry. A secret had been sewn into the heart of this toy, hidden away from the world for 10 long years. A sense of urgency, mixed with a creeping dread, took hold of Catherine. This was no longer about cleaning out an old attic. This was about those three girls whose ghostly laughter had just echoed in her mind. They weren't just names in a file anymore. They were a presence in this room, their story unfinished. The doll was their voice, their final message. The official report had closed the book on their disappearance, but this small, forgotten object was demanding it be reopened. Catherine's administrative duty had just collided with a moral imperative, a responsibility to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried or how much time had passed. With hands that trembled slightly, she located a loose strand in the dark, foreign stitching. She pulled gently at first, then with more determination. The ill thread resisted for a moment before snapping with a faint, dry sound. Carefully, she worked her finger into the small opening, pushing aside the dense stuffing. Her fingertips brushed against something smooth and folded. It wasn't cotton. It was cloth, stiff with age. As she drew it out into the dim light, she saw that it was a small, hand-drawn map, its lines stitched with colored thread. It depicted the layout of the attic, marking a location near the far wall with a crudely drawn star and the words, "Secret Exit." The girls hadn't been running away. They had been following a map. The small, stiff piece of cloth felt impossibly heavy in Catherine's hands. The air, thick with the ghosts of forgotten things, seemed to crystallize around her. Each suspended dust mote, a tiny, silent witness to this unearthed secret. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, involuntary gasp that broke the oppressive quiet of the attic. The map wasn't a child's whimsical drawing. Its stitched lines felt deliberate, desperate. The world outside, with its sounds of children playing and the distant hum of traffic, vanished completely. There was only this room, this doll, and the sudden, crushing realization that the story of Blackwood Pines was a carefully constructed lie. This small object was a single, defiant thread, and pulling it threatened to unravel everything. A cold dread, sharp and invasive, settled deep in her bones, a premonition that she had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Her mind struggled to process the contradiction. The official report from November 1995 was clinical and concise. An open window, a rope of knotted bedsheets on the ground below, a clear case of 3 troubled girls running away. But this map, with its crudely marked secret exit, quote, told a different story. Why would they need a clandestine route if they were simply climbing out a window? It made no sense. This wasn't the work of impulsive runaways. It was the meticulous planning of children who believed they were escaping through a hidden passage, a route unknown to the adults who governed their lives. The neat narrative that had settled over this case for a decade suddenly felt flimsy. A thin veil draped over a much darker and more complex truth that had been patiently waiting for a fresh pair of eyes. A wave of profound empathy washed over her, so potent it felt like grief. She pictured 3 small girls, huddled together in this very attic, their heads bent in concentration as they stitched their hopes into this piece of fabric. She imagined their whispered secrets, their shared fears, and the desperate courage it must have taken to plot their escape. This map wasn't just an object. It was the last will and testament of their childhood, a tangible piece of their final shared dream. They weren't just names in a dusty file anymore. Emily, Sarah, and Jessica. They were real, their presence filling the suffocating space around her. Catherine felt an overwhelming duty to them, a need to honor the desperate hope that was so carefully folded and hidden away inside the heart of their silent, one-eyed confidant. She smoothed the cloth map over her knee, studying its details under the weak light filtering through the grimy window. The landmarks were a child's interpretation of the attic's geography. A stack of trunks became a mountain range, a cobwebbed corner was a dark forest, and the path to the exit was a winding river stitched in blue thread. Near the far wall, a bright yellow star marked their destination. The craftsmanship was both clumsy and careful, the work of small, determined hands. This was a project born of necessity, a secret kept with the fierce loyalty that only children can muster. It was their singular focus, their beacon in the dark. The level of detail and care invested in its creation screamed that this was not a game. For them, this was a matter of life and death. The ghostly image of the three girls laughing in the hallway returned, but now it was tinged with an unbearable sadness. Their bright, mischievous faces were now masks of tragedy. They had placed all their faith in this map, in this secret exit. They believed it was their path to a new life, away from the cold, institutional walls of Blackwood Pines. Catherine could almost feel their nervous excitement, the thumping of their hearts as they prepared to embark on their great adventure. The attic no longer felt empty. It felt haunted by the echoes of that misplaced trust. A chilling question began to form in her mind. What if the secret exit wasn't an exit at all? What if it was a destination from which they were never meant to return? A slow-burning anger began to smolder in Catherine's chest, replacing the initial shock and sorrow. She was angry at the system, at the faceless bureaucracy that had so easily dismissed three vulnerable children as delinquents. The runaway theory was clean, convenient. It required no difficult questions, no deep investigation, no accountability. It allowed the institution to move on, to bury its failures, along with the memories of the girls. But this doll, this map, it was a piece of evidence that had been either criminally overlooked or deliberately ignored. Someone had wanted this story to end in 1995. Someone had counted on this attic remaining sealed, its secrets undisturbed. Her role as director suddenly felt like a hollow title. Her true purpose was now to be their advocate. The renovation of the attic was no longer a priority. It was an impossibility. This space was not a blank canvas for a future playroom. It was a memorial, a place of last resort, and potentially a tomb. Every speck of dust, every forgotten box, was now part of a decade-old puzzle. Her administrative duties seemed trivial in the face of this profound discovery. A moral imperative had seized her, a responsibility that transcended her job description. She was the one who had found the doll, the one who had unearthed the map. The universe, or perhaps the lingering spirits of the girls themselves, had chosen her to be their voice. She had to follow their path. She had to know where the yellow star led, no matter the consequences. With the map spread open, she began to scan the attic, her gaze now sharp and analytical. The room transformed before her eyes from a cluttered storage space into a grid of clues. The mountain range of old steamer trunks was still there, as was the dark forest of cobwebs in the corner. Her eyes settled on the far wall, the spot marked with the yellow star. It was a solid expanse of dark, aged wood planks, identical to the rest of the attic walls. There was no outline of a door, no visible hinges, no knob. It was seamless, impenetrable. If there was a passage there, it was designed to be completely invisible, a secret known only to a select few. The thought that children had discovered something the adults had missed was both impressive and deeply unsettling. The doll's single button eye seemed to follow her every move, its stitched face holding an expression she now interpreted as a desperate plea. For 10 years it had sat in this suffocating darkness, a silent guardian of the truth. It had held its secret tight, waiting for someone with the patience to look closer, to feel the unnatural lump in its stuffing, to question the official story. Catherine gently placed the doll on a nearby crate, a silent promise passing between her and the inanimate object. "I will find out what happened to you," she whispered, the words feeling like a sacred vow in the hallowed silence. "I will find out what happened to all of you." The weight of that promise was immense, settling upon her shoulders like a physical shroud. She knew this path would not be easy. Reopening a closed case, especially one that the institution itself had been so eager to put to rest, would be met with resistance. It meant challenging the decisions and the integrity of her predecessor, Mr. Arthur Blackwood, a man whose reputation was built on order and control. It meant inviting scrutiny, dredging up a painful past, and potentially uncovering a truth that was deliberately and maliciously buried. People would call her obsessive, tell her to let the past go, but looking at the small, hand-stitched map, she knew that was impossible. The past wasn't gone. It was right here, in her hands, demanding to be heard. The girls deserved more than a footnote in a file cabinet. They deserved justice. Clutching the doll in one arm and the precious map in the other, Catherine descended the creaking attic stairs, leaving the stagnant, dusty air behind. Each step down felt like a step deeper into a mystery that was far more sinister than she could have imagined. The normal sounds of the children's home, the distant clang of the kitchen, the murmur of a television, seemed to belong to a different world, one of innocence she no longer inhabited. She had gone up into the attic as a director, an administrator focused on the future. She came down as a custodian of the past, the unwilling keeper of a terrible secret. She knew with a chilling certainty that the secret exit on the map was not a path to freedom. It was the beginning of the real story, but this was just the beginning of what was to come. The discovery of a simple map inside a forgotten doll had just cracked open a 10-year-old mystery, and the path forward is filled with dark secrets and uncomfortable truths. What would you do if you found something like this? Would you have the courage to pursue the truth, knowing it could put you in danger and unravel the lives of those around you? We're about to go deep into this investigation, and your support means everything. Please, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single clue. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think happened to those 3 little girls. Do you think you could handle the weight of a discovery that changes everything? November 1995 was a time defined by a cold, biting wind that rattled the old window panes of Blackwood Pines Children's Home. Inside those walls, life was a predictable rhythm of bells and routines, a sterile environment where 3 young girls had forged an unbreakable bond. Emily, at 10, was the trio's undisputed leader, her mind sharp and her gaze steady. Sarah, 9, was the quiet observer, an artist who captured their small world in a tattered sketchbook. And Jessica, the youngest at 8, was the heart of their group, a whirlwind of boundless optimism and infectious laughter. They were more than friends. They were a self-made family, a tiny island of warmth and fierce loyalty in an ocean of institutional indifference. They navigated the bleakness of their existence by creating a world of their own, one rich with imagination and shared secrets. The Blackwood Pines Children's Home was a place that prided itself on order and discipline, not warmth and affection. Under the directorship of Mr. Arthur Blackwood, the sprawling brick building was run with the precision of a military barracks. The long, echoing hallways smelled perpetually of industrial cleaner and boiled vegetables, a scent that clung to the children's clothes and hair. Days were structured from the 6 a.m. wake-up bell to the 8 p.m. lights out, every moment accounted for. Individuality was a liability, and emotional outbursts were swiftly managed with quiet, firm correction. It was a system designed to produce compliant, unremarkable citizens, and for most children, it succeeded in sanding down the rough edges of their personalities until they were smooth, quiet, and easily overlooked. This oppressive atmosphere was the soil in which the girls' desperate need for escape took root. At the helm of this rigid institution was Mr. Arthur Blackwood, a man in his late 50s whose stern demeanor and immaculate suits were as much a part of the building as its brick and mortar. He rarely interacted with the children directly, preferring to observe them from the polished confines of his office. To him, they were not individuals with hopes and fears, but assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. His primary objective was maintaining the home's pristine reputation, ensuring that no scandal ever tainted its name or threatened its funding. He moved through the halls with an air of cold authority, his presence alone enough to silence a room. The children learned early on to become invisible around him, to never draw the kind of attention that could lead to a summons to his dreaded, soundproofed office. In stark contrast to the director was George, the custodian. A quiet, gentle man who had worked at Blackwood Pines for over 30 years, he was a silent fixture in the girls' lives. While Blackwood represented the cold, unfeeling system, George was a small source of humanity. He was the one who would discreetly fix a broken toy, slip an extra biscuit onto a dinner tray, or offer a kind, knowing wink when he saw the girls engaged in some minor, harmless mischief. They trusted him implicitly, often sharing small secrets with him they would tell no other adult. George, in turn, felt a deep, protective affection for the trio, but he was also a man who understood his place. He was an employee, and his loyalty to the institution, and by extension to Mr. Blackwood, was a complex, tangled thing that often left him caught between his conscience and his livelihood. The attic, officially forbidden and perpetually locked, was the trio's secret kingdom. To the adults it was a repository of forgotten furniture and discarded records, but to Emily, Sarah, and Jessica, it was a magical realm where they were free. Up in that dusty, silent space, under the heavy timber beams, they were adventurers, queens, and explorers. They built forts out of old trunks and sailed imaginary seas on discarded carpets. It was their sanctuary from the rigid schedules and watchful eyes below. Here they whispered their dreams of real families and lives outside the institution's gates. The attic was the heart of their shared world, the one place where they felt completely safe, completely themselves. It was here that their greatest adventure was planned, a final, desperate game that they believed would lead them to true freedom. Their games, however, began to take on a more serious edge in the months leading up to their disappearance. Emily, with her keen eye for detail, had started noticing things, small inconsistencies that didn't add up. She saw Mr. Blackwood meeting with strange men in unmarked cars late at night and noticed boxes of donated food and clothing vanishing from the storeroom before they could be distributed. Their make-believe games of spies and detectives slowly became real as they started to document what they saw, with Sarah sketching the strange men's faces and Jessica keeping a lookout. They believed they were on the verge of uncovering a terrible secret, a darkness at the heart of Blackwood Pines. The thrill of their investigation was intoxicating, blinding them to the very real danger they were putting themselves in. The legend of a secret exit was a piece of Blackwood Pines folklore, a story passed down through generations of orphans as a whisper of hope. Most children dismissed it as a fairy tale, but for the trio, it became a tangible goal. Fueled by their discoveries about Mr. Blackwood, the mythical exit transformed from a whimsical fantasy into a necessary escape route. They became convinced they had found it, a hidden path that would lead them out of the home and to a place where they could tell someone the truth. The creation of the map became their singular focus. They spent weeks in the attic, meticulously stitching their path onto the small piece of cloth, using colored threads to mark landmarks. This map wasn't just a plan, it was a sacred object, a physical manifestation of their courage and their desperate hope for justice. On that final, frigid evening in November 1995, an electric tension filled the air around the three girls. They moved through their evening routine with a quiet, focused energy, exchanging looks that were a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They had confided in George telling him only that they were going on a, quote, adventure through a magic door, trusting that their vague words would be enough to ensure he wouldn't raise an alarm. Their last meal in the loud, clattering dining hall was eaten in near silence, their minds already in the dusty sanctuary of the attic. They believed their meticulously crafted plan was foolproof. They had their map, their courage, and each other. They were not running away in disgrace. They were escaping as heroes, ready to expose a villain and finally claim the future they deserved. The bond between the three girls was a force of nature within the sterile walls of Blackwood Pines. Emily, with a mind that worked like a clockmaker's, devised their plans. She was the strategist, the one who understood the patterns of the adults and the building's hidden rhythms. Sarah was their chronicler, her worn sketchbook filled not with childish doodles but with detailed maps of the grounds, portraits of staff members captured in moments of carelessness, and intricate drawings of keys she'd seen on George's belt loop. Jessica, radiant and fearless, was their instrument of action. Her disarming innocence allowed her to wander into places the older girls couldn't, to ask questions that seemed harmless but were carefully crafted by Emily. They were a perfectly balanced organism, a three-part system of intelligence, observation, and execution, moving with a singular purpose through a world that was designed to crush their spirits. Their unity was their greatest strength and, ultimately, their most profound vulnerability. Mr. Arthur Blackwood's control over the home was absolute, a reign built on the careful cultivation of fear and the illusion of pristine order. His obsession with reputation was legendary among the staff. He once expelled a teenage boy not for fighting but for telling a visiting donor that the donated winter coats had never been distributed. The boy was labeled a liar and a troublemaker and was transferred to a state facility within a week. The message was brutally clear. The truth was secondary to the narrative Blackwood constructed. He managed the home like a public relations firm, where the children were props in a carefully staged performance of institutional success. This environment taught the girls a critical lesson. The most dangerous secrets at Blackwood Pines were not the ones the children kept, but the ones the director was determined to protect at any cost. George the custodian navigated this treacherous landscape with a practiced, weary silence. He was a ghost in the machine, his presence so constant it became invisible. He saw everything. He saw the way the girls would huddle in the library, whispering over Sarah's sketchbook, and he saw the cold, calculating look in Blackwood's eyes when he watched them. One afternoon, George found Jessica crying in the laundry room over her rag doll, its calico dress torn. Without a word, he took it to his small workshop and returned it. An hour later, the tear mended with a neat, almost invisible stitch. As he handed it back, Mr. Blackwood's footsteps echoed down the hall. George's warm smile vanished, his shoulders slumped, and he immediately busied himself with a mop, his face a mask of deference. In that moment, the girls understood the impossible position he was in, caught between kindness and fear. The secret the girls were unraveling began with a discarded ledger they found in the attic, mistakenly left in a box of old-school supplies. Emily, though only 10, recognized the columns of figures and the names of local businesses. Sarah painstakingly copied the pages into her sketchbook. They started noticing discrepancies. Large donations of food, clothing, and funds announced in the local paper that never materialized within the home. They overheard hushed, angry phone calls from Blackwood's office, words like shipment, discretion, and off the books. They didn't understand the full scope of the embezzlement, but they understood the fundamental injustice. They were going hungry, while the man in charge was getting rich. Their investigation, which had started as a game, had become a moral crusade. They were gathering proof, convinced that if they could just get it outside these walls, someone would finally have to listen. Their shared doll was the keeper of this dangerous knowledge. It was more than a toy. It was a totem, a silent repository for their hopes and fears. Every night, after lights out, they would take turns whispering their findings into its yarn hair. Emily would detail their strategies, Sarah would describe the faces of the men who met with Blackwood in the dead of night, and Jessica would confess her fears, pressing the doll's button eye to her cheek for comfort. The doll absorbed their secrets, its stitched smile a constant, reassuring presence in the dark. It was the physical manifestation of their pact, a silent fourth member of their conspiracy. The idea of leaving it behind was unthinkable. Wherever they went, the doll, and the truth it held, was meant to go with them. It was their ark, carrying the covenant of their shared mission. As autumn bled into the harsh, early winter of 1995, a palpable sense of dread began to permeate the air at Blackwood Pines. The wind howled around the corners of the old building like a mournful spirit, and the early darkness seemed to shrink their world, making the long hallways feel more claustrophobic than ever. The girls felt a shift in the atmosphere. Mr. Blackwood's gaze lingered on them a moment too long in the dining hall. He started making unpredictable rounds, his polished shoes appearing silently outside the library or the laundry room. They felt his suspicion like a change in barometric pressure, a storm gathering just over the horizon. The thrill of their secret investigation was replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The secret exit was no longer a fantastical escape route. It was their only chance of survival. They knew, with the primal instinct of vulnerable prey, that they were running out of time. Months before the girls vanished, Detective Miller had been to Blackwood Pines. He was a young detective then, responding to a routine call about a minor theft from the kitchen pantry. The case was insignificant, but his brief meeting with Director Blackwood left a lasting impression. Miller was struck by the man's unnerving lack of empathy and his obsessive focus on how the incident would appear in a report. Blackwood seemed more concerned with the paperwork than the well-being of the hungry child who had stolen a loaf of bread. Miller had left the home with a vague sense of unease, a feeling that the institution's polished facade concealed something cold and rotten at its core. He made a private note in the file, a simple observation. Director Blackwood displays a concerning disregard for the children under his care. The institution feels more like a prison than a home. It was a note that would haunt him for the next decade. In their final days, the girls' world had shrunk to the size of their hand-stitched map. It was their scripture, their declaration of independence. Every stitched line, every colored thread was imbued with their desperate faith. They had shown a simplified version to George, framing it as part of an elaborate fantasy game. "We're going to a magic kingdom through a secret door in the attic," Jessica had told him, her eyes wide with a mixture of real and feigned excitement. George, seeing only the innocence of a child's imagination, had simply smiled and ruffled her hair, telling them to be safe on their adventure. He dismissed it as the kind of elaborate make-believe that was their trademark. He had no way of knowing that he was the last adult they would ever truly trust, and that his gentle, unknowing dismissal would become the heaviest burden of his life. Their faith was absolute, their plan was set, and their one trusted friend saw nothing but a game. Catherine descended from the attic, as if emerging from a deep-sea dive, the pressure of the last hour still ringing in her ears. The children's home operated on its usual rhythm around her, the distant shouts from the playground, the smell of lunch cooking in the kitchen, but it all felt muffled, part of a world she no longer fully inhabited. She clutched the rag doll and the small cloth map to her chest, physical anchors to a reality that had just irrevocably shifted. Her office, usually a place of administrative order and forward planning, now felt like the only sanctuary where she could confront the ghost she had just unearthed. She locked the door behind her, the click of the bolt, a definitive sound separating the past from the present, and stood in the silence, her heart hammering against her ribs with the weight of a secret that was not hers to carry alone. Under the sterile fluorescent light of her desk lamp, the hand-stitched map looked even more fragile and desperate. Catherine smoothed its creased fabric, her fingers tracing the faded blue thread of the river, and the bright yellow star marking the secret exit. Her first logical step was to cross-reference this child's fantasy with architectural fact. She pulled out the original blueprints of the Blackwood Pines building, massive sheets of brittle, yellowed paper dated 1928. She located the attic on the schematics, her finger tracing the perimeter. The plans were unequivocal. The far wall, where the girls had marked their star of hope, was depicted as a solid, load-bearing structure, an uninterrupted expanse of timber and plaster. There was no door, no passage, no exit. According to the official record, the place the girls were heading simply did not exist. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The discrepancy was stark and terrifying. On one hand, she held the cold, empirical evidence of the building's construction, lines and measurements that had stood for nearly a century. On the other, she held a desperate message from 3 children who had vanished into thin air. The map was not a flight of fancy. The careful stitching and the way it was hidden spoke of its profound importance. This was their truth. The thought of walking into a police station with this story felt absurd. A 10-year-old cold case, a doll, and a child's map that contradicted the building's own blueprints? They would thank her for her time and file it away in a box labeled unsubstantiated. She knew with chilling certainty that she couldn't rely on the authorities. Not yet. She had to find tangible proof. She had to find the wall. Her mind raced, searching for an ally, for someone who knew the building not as a set of plans, but as a living, breathing entity with its own history and secrets. The answer was immediate and obvious. George, the custodian. He had been at Blackwood Pines for over 30 years, a silent witness to its entire modern history. She found him in the cavernous, dimly lit boiler room, the air thick with the smell of oil and hot metal. He was tightening a valve on a labyrinth of pipes, his movements slow and methodical. When he saw her, his face registered mild surprise, but his eyes, she now noticed, held a deep, permanent weariness. He was a man who had seen too much and said too little. Approaching him felt like stepping into a minefield. One wrong word, and any truth he held could be buried forever. Catherine chose her words carefully, presenting the map not as a piece of evidence, but as an oddity she'd found. "George, I was clearing out the attic and found this." The children used to tell stories, didn't they? About a secret exit. The effect was instantaneous and profound. George's hand froze, and the heavy steel wrench he was holding slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the concrete floor with a deafening clang that echoed through the vast room. His face, already pale in the dim light, lost all its remaining color. He stammered a denial, his eyes darting away from hers. "It was just a game," he insisted, his voice raspy and thin. "Silly stories. Mr. Blackwood hated them." His panicked reaction, the sheer terror in his eyes, was a confession in itself. He wasn't just familiar with the story, he was afraid of it. She pressed her advantage, her voice softening with empathy. She held up the doll. "This was with the map. It was Jessica's, wasn't it?" The mention of the girl's name was like a physical blow. George flinched and finally met her gaze, his own eyes swimming with a guilt so old and heavy it seemed to physically stoop his shoulders. He nodded slowly, a single, heartbreaking admission. He confessed that the 3 girls had been utterly consumed by their adventure, convinced they were on the brink of a great discovery. Then came the crucial detail. Just weeks before they disappeared, Mr. Blackwood had become obsessed with attic security, ordering George to install a new, heavy-duty bolt on the door and forbidding anyone, staff included, from entering without his express permission. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. A new, terrifying clarity began to form in Catherine's mind. This wasn't just about finding a hidden passage anymore. This was about understanding why it had been so important for Blackwood to keep people out of that specific space at that specific time. The urgency was now a burning imperative. "George," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "we have to go back up there, right now, you and me." He looked at her, his face a mask of fear, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He gave another slow, defeated nod. He retrieved his fallen wrench and then walked to a rusty locker, pulling out a long crowbar and a heavy industrial flashlight. As they ascended the stairs back toward the attic, the silence between them was thick with unspoken dread. They were no longer just a director and a custodian. They were 2 people about to excavate a grave. The attic felt colder this time, the air more stagnant. The single beam from George's flashlight cut a nervous path through the thick darkness, illuminating the swirling dust motes like lost souls. He led the way to the far wall, his steps heavy and reluctant. Catherine held the map, its yellow star seeming to glow in the gloom. George began tapping the wooden planks with the head of the crowbar. Thud, thud. The sounds were solid, final. But then, as he moved lower near the floorboards, one tap produced a different sound entirely, a deep, hollow boom that vibrated through the floor. It was the sound of empty space. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. George found a nearly invisible seam between two planks and wedged the tip of the crowbar into the crack. With a groan of protesting wood and a shower of decade-old dust, a section of the wall began to give way. The sound of old wood tearing was a scream that ripped through the attic silence. George put his shoulder into the crowbar, and with a final, violent crack, a rectangular section of the wall swung inward on hidden, rusted hinges. A wave of air, impossibly stale and cold, washed over them. An ancient breath held for a decade and now exhaled. It carried a dry, acrid scent of decay and something else, something deeply unsettling that made the hairs on Catherine's arms stand on end. She held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the doll. The beam from George's flashlight trembled violently, cutting a frantic, shaky path into the absolute blackness of the space they had just uncovered. The world had just shrunk to the size of this dark, gaping hole in the wall. The space beyond was not a passage. It was a coffin. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow, vertical shaft, no wider than a closet, extending perhaps 10 feet back before ending in another solid wall of rough-hewn timber. It was a dead end, a brutal architectural lie. Dust, thick and undisturbed for years, coated every surface like a fine gray velvet. The air was heavy, devoid of life, a pocket of time that had been hermetically sealed away from the world. Catherine's mind reeled at the cruel deception. The girls' map, their beacon of hope, had led them here to this claustrophobic, lightless void. This wasn't an exit designed for escape. It was a cage built for containment, a deliberate and final trap designed with chilling, meticulous cruelty. All the romantic notions Catherine had entertained about a childhood adventure, a secret game, evaporated in that cold, stale air. A profound and sickening sorrow washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. She pictured Emily, Sarah, and Jessica, their small hands clutching their precious map, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration as they stepped into this space. They would have been expecting a ladder, a tunnel, a path to freedom. Instead, they would have found only darkness and a door swinging shut behind them, the final, terrible click sealing their fate. The yellow star on the map, once a symbol of hope, now seemed like a cruel joke, a marker on a treasure map that led only to death. George made a sound, a choked, guttural sob that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of his soul. He dropped the crowbar, and it landed with a dull thud on the dusty floorboards. He didn't step forward. He was frozen in place, his face a grotesque mask of anguish, and a guilt so profound it was terrifying to witness. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Oh, no, not here." He knew, in that moment, Catherine was certain of it. He had known, or at least suspected, what lay behind this wall for 10 long years. His fear of opening this space hadn't been about breaking rules or angering a former director. It was the terror of confirming a nightmare he had lived with in silence. Catherine took the flashlight from George's limp hand, her own movements feeling robotic and detached from her body. She forced herself to aim the beam toward the back of the narrow enclosure. At first, it was just a jumble of shapes in the corner, a pile of what looked like discarded rags. Then the light caught the unmistakable, delicate curve of a small rib cage. The beam moved higher, illuminating the hollow sockets of a child's skull. They were not just rags. They were the skeletal remains of 3 small children, huddled together in a final, desperate embrace. They were still dressed in the faded, threadbare remnants of their nightgowns, the fabric fused with dust and time, a heartbreaking testament to the night they had vanished from the world forever. The truth was absolute, undeniable, and more horrific than anything she could have imagined. Emily, Sarah, Jessica, they had never run away. They hadn't fallen from a window. They had died here, just a few feet from the attic where they played, trapped in this suffocating darkness. Catherine's gaze fixed on a tiny, metallic glint near one of the skulls. It was a small, heart-shaped locket, tarnished black with age, lying amidst the delicate bones of a clavicle. A wave of nausea and rage crested within her. These weren't just remains. They were children who had been left to starve, to slowly succumb to thirst and terror, while the life of the home continued on, just on the other side of this wall. The institutional silence wasn't just neglect. It was an act of profound violence. A strangled gasp escaped Catherine's lips, and she stumbled backward, away from the opening, away from the smell and the sight of it. The logical, orderly mind of the administrator shattered, leaving only raw, visceral horror. Her hands shook so violently she could barely retrieve the cell phone from her pocket. She fumbled with the keypad, her fingers slick with a cold sweat, her vision blurring with tears of shock and fury. She dialed 911, the numbers feeling alien and surreal. When the operator's calm voice answered, Catherine could only manage a choked, fragmented sentence. "Blackwood Pines Children's Home," she stammered, her voice breaking. "You need to send the police. We've found them. We've found the girls." This discovery wasn't just reopening a case. It was declaring a war on a decade of lies. While she spoke to the dispatcher, the beam of the flashlight, now resting on the floor, cast a single, unwavering ray of light into the tomb. It illuminated the scene in a stark, unblinking tableau of tragedy. George had collapsed to his knees, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with silent, agonizing sobs of a grief long suppressed. On a crate nearby, Jessica's doll sat propped up, its one button eye fixed on the dark opening, a silent sentinel that had kept its vigil for 10 years. The attic was no longer a space of forgotten memories. It was a consecrated crime scene. The long silence of Blackwood Pines had finally been broken, not by a whisper, but by a deafening scream from the past that would demand to be heard. The arrival of the first police cruisers shattered the quiet dignity of Blackwood Pines, their flashing blue and red lights painting the old brick building in stark, frantic strokes. The attic, once a place of silent memory, was transformed into a sterile grid of yellow tape and methodical, white-suited forensic technicians. Detective Miller, pulled from the brink of retirement by a call he had both dreaded and prayed for over the past decade, ascended the stairs with a heavy heart. The man who had been a young, sharp detective in 1995 was now stooped, his face a roadmap of regret. When he saw the small, huddled skeletons in the beam of a forensic light, his composure cracked. He recognized the tarnished, heart-shaped locket near the smallest skull. It had been a birthday gift to Jessica from the staff. In that moment, the cold case file became a living, breathing wound that had just been torn open anew. In her office, which now felt like the eye of a storm, Catherine met with the detective. Miller's initial gaze was weary and appraising, the look of a man who had seen too many well-intentioned administrators come and go. But then he saw the rag doll sitting on her desk, its single-button eye staring into the middle distance, and the small, hand-stitched map laid out beside it. He understood instantly that Catherine was not part of the institutional machine that had buried this case. She was the one who had unearthed it. An unspoken alliance formed between them, a shared commitment to the 3 girls who had been denied a voice for so long. Miller confessed his own demons, admitting that Blackwood's insistence on the runaway theory and the pressure from his superiors had felt wrong from the start, a convenient lie that had haunted his every working day since. The preliminary forensic report landed on Miller's desk less than 48 hours later, its clinical language a brutal counterpoint to the human tragedy. Cause of death for all 3 victims was confirmed as dehydration and acute malnutrition. The pathologist had included a chilling addendum, estimating that based on the state of the remains and the conditions within the sealed space, the girls could have survived for as long as a week. Catherine read the report, her vision blurring as she imagined their final days, the fading hope, the terror, the slow, agonizing descent into silence, all while the sounds of life in the home continued just a few feet away. The factual evidence transformed the horror from a shocking spectacle into a documented, minute-by-minute account of suffering, making the need for justice a burning, physical ache within her. While the primary cause of death was clear, a deeper question gnawed at Detective Miller. How had the girls become trapped? It was a detail that defied a simple accident. He remembered the solid, impenetrable feeling of that wall from his brief inspection in 1995. Drawing on a hunch that had festered for 10 years, he ordered a specialist, an old-world locksmith and historical hardware expert, to examine the locking mechanism on the section of wall that served as the door. His team carefully documented, removed, and transported the rusted, heavy latch to the expert's workshop. It seemed like a minor detail to the younger officers, but Miller knew that in cold cases, the truth often resided not in the grand narrative, but in the smallest, most overlooked pieces of physical evidence. The fate of the entire investigation now rested on the secrets held within that single piece of corroded iron. The first official interview was with Arthur Blackwood. Miller and a junior detective found him in a meticulously manicured garden at an exclusive retirement villa, the picture of placid dignity. His reaction to the news was a masterclass in cold detachment. He expressed a rehearsed formal regret, but quickly pivoted to defending his original handling of the case, describing the girls as prone to elaborate fictions and notoriously rebellious. He suggested their game had simply gone tragically wrong, a sad consequence of their own poor judgment. He dismissed Catherine's discovery as the meddling of a newcomer, seeking to make a name for herself. Throughout the interview, he never once used the girls' names. To Blackwood, they were not victims. They were a decade-old administrative problem that had inconveniently resurfaced, a stain on his otherwise immaculate legacy. The interrogation of George the custodian was a starkly different affair. He sat in a small, bare room at the police station, his entire body trembling, his face a landscape of profound, soul-deep misery. He was a man drowning in a guilt he could no longer contain. His testimony was a fractured, rambling mess of contradictions. He admitted he knew the girls saw the attic as their secret kingdom, and that they were playing a detective game about Mr. Blackwood, but he swore he never knew about the hidden passage. "He told me to stay out of there." George wept, his words muffled by his hands. "He said it was for storage. Unsafe." Miller listened patiently, discerning a kernel of truth buried in the panic. George was terrified, but it wasn't the fear of an accomplice. It was the paralyzing fear of a man who knew he had stood by and done nothing, while a monster walked the halls. The locksmith's report came back, and it was the bombshell that blew the case wide open. It was not a report, it was a verdict. The expert confirmed that the locking mechanism was not part of the building's original 1928 construction. It was a heavy-duty bolt latch, installed no earlier than 1990. The most damning finding, however, was in the final paragraph. The mechanism had been deliberately and skillfully modified. A small internal catch had been filed down, and the bolt housing was altered in such a way that while it could be easily slid shut from the outside, it was physically impossible to retract from within. There were no marks indicating it had been forced or broken. It had worked exactly as its creator had intended. This was not a secret passage. It was a purpose-built tomb. It was premeditated murder. The official reclassification of the case from a missing persons investigation to a triple homicide sent shockwaves through the community. The story was leaked to the press, and Blackwood Pines Children's Home was besieged by news vans and reporters, their cameras aimed at the building like weapons. The carefully constructed piece Catherine had been trying to build was shattered. She was now forced to operate a home for vulnerable children in the middle of a high-profile murder investigation, shielding them from the gruesome headlines while simultaneously fielding calls from panicked social workers and outraged board members. The weight of her dual responsibilities was crushing. She was not just the director anymore. She was the custodian of a crime scene and the protector of a new generation of children from the ghosts that had just been violently awakened. Armed with a locksmith's report, Detective Miller and Catherine dug into the institution's archives, a mountain of dusty boxes containing the paper trail of Blackwood's tenure. Deep within a box of old maintenance records from 1994, they found it, a work order for attic structural reinforcement and door repairs. The order specifically requested the installation of a new high-security bolt on the main attic door and, more chillingly, included a line item for, quote, custom carpentry work on north wall storage access. The request was signed and authorized by Arthur Blackwood himself. The work was completed and signed off on by George. The two primary suspects were now bound together by a single, damning piece of paper, a documented link to the creation of the very trap that had sealed the girls' fate. The motive, however, remained elusive until Catherine, acting on a hunch, requested the archived personal effects of the three girls. In a sealed box labeled Jessica M., she found the rag doll. In a box for Sarah P., she found a worn, tattered sketchbook. It was a treasure trove of evidence hidden in plain sight. Mixed in with childish drawings of flowers and animals were shockingly detailed sketches of unfamiliar men in suits exchanging envelopes with Blackwood in the dead of night. There were pages where Sarah had painstakingly copied columns of figures from a ledger, complete with notes in Emily's more mature handwriting questioning missing food and coat donation. The girls hadn't just stumbled upon a secret. They were building a case. They had discovered Blackwood's systematic embezzlement of the home's funds and resources, and they had documented everything. The entire scope of the investigation had now irrevocably escalated. This was no longer just the tragic story of three murdered children. It was a conspiracy rooted in greed and protected by a wall of institutional power. Blackwood hadn't just silenced three rebellious orphans. He had executed the only witnesses to his extensive criminal enterprise. The knotted bedsheets and the open window in 1995 were not signs of an escape. They were a carefully staged diversion, a piece of theater designed to sell a lie, while the real evidence, the girls themselves, was slowly erased by time behind a solid wall. Miller realized with a cold certainty that Blackwood was not just a murderer, but a meticulous, ruthless criminal who had used his position of absolute authority to commit an unspeakable evil and then hide it behind a facade of civic duty for 10 long years. Sarah's sketchbook was the key that unlocked the motive. Spread across Detective Miller's desk, the fragile, yellowed pages were a child's meticulous indictment of a predator. The crude but clear drawings of Arthur Blackwood exchanging envelopes with shadowy figures, combined with Emily's handwritten notes questioning missing donations, painted a devastating picture. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden violent impulse. It was the cold, calculated act of a man protecting a lucrative criminal enterprise. The girls hadn't just stumbled upon a secret. They had stumbled upon the source of Blackwood's power and wealth. Their deaths were not a tragedy born from a game gone wrong. They were a business expense, the cost of silencing three witnesses who were too smart, too observant, and too brave for their own good. The scope of the crime had just expanded from murder to a decade of systematic fraud. The faces in the sketchbook became the investigation's new focal point. Miller assigned two of his best detectives to the task of identifying the men Sarah had drawn with such haunting accuracy. They were not the faces of common criminals. They were depicted in sharp suits, standing beside expensive cars, their postures exuding an air of untouchable authority. These were Blackwood's partners. Miller knew instinctively that the embezzlement scheme was too large for one man to manage alone. He needed a network to move and sell the stolen goods, a network that likely extended far beyond the iron gates of Blackwood Pines. The investigation was no longer confined to the events of a single November night in 1995. It was now an inquiry into a potential conspiracy that had operated in the city's shadows for years, protected by wealth and influence. While the police pursued their leads, Catherine felt a profound, almost spiritual connection to the sketchbook. She spent hours with it, seeing not just evidence, but the last creative act of a gifted child. She decided to digitally archive every page, to preserve Sarah's voice. It was during this painstaking process, while zooming in on a high-resolution scan, that she noticed a detail everyone else had missed. In the corner of every drawing that depicted a late-night transaction, Sarah had sketched a tiny, recurring symbol, a stylized bird with its wings outstretched, like a phoenix rising. It was so small, so subtle, it could have been a simple doodle, but its consistent presence suggested something more. It was a brand, a logo, a signature. It was a clue left in a language only a child would think to use. Armed with the sketchbook and the damning maintenance work order, Miller brought George the custodian back for another interview. This time, there was no gentle questioning. Miller laid the evidence on the cold metal table, the work order with George's signature authorizing the custom carpentry on the hidden door, and Sarah's drawing of Blackwood shaking hands with a man whose face George clearly recognized. The custodian's facade of fearful ignorance crumbled completely. The sight of his own signature next to the child's drawing was a physical blow. A wave of uncontrollable sobs wrecked his body. The fear of Arthur Blackwood, which had held him silent for a decade, was finally overwhelmed by the crushing, unbearable weight of his own complicity. He began to speak, his voice a broken whisper, confessing not to murder but to the sin of his silence. George's testimony was a torrent of suppressed memories. He described the unmarked trucks that would arrive in the dead of night, twice a month, like clockwork. He spoke of being ordered by Blackwood to help load heavy boxes labeled surplus or disposal. He never questioned what was inside. He knew better. He saw crates of new winter coats, donated electronics, and high-quality canned goods being loaded onto these trucks, never to be seen by the children. For his silence and his labor, Blackwood would leave a cash-filled envelope in his locker, never enough to make him rich, but just enough to make him a co-conspirator. Crucially, he remembered the name of the company on the side of one of the trucks and the address of the warehouse where they always went, a location in the city's industrial district. The police raid on the warehouse was executed at dawn. The business operating there now was a legitimate, albeit struggling, logistics company. But the warrant allowed them to search the building's deep storage archives. In a dusty, forgotten corner of the basement, buried beneath years of new inventory, they found them. Boxes of shipping manifests from 1993 to 1996. The paperwork detailed hundreds of shipments originating from Blackwood Pines Children's Home, with their contents grossly undervalued for tax purposes. The destination for every shipment was a shell corporation named Phoenix Distribution. When Miller saw the company's letterhead, a cold chill ran down his spine. The logo printed in the top corner was a stylized bird with outstretched wings, identical to the one Sarah had drawn in her sketchbook. The investigation into Phoenix Distribution tore the lid off a vast, festering conspiracy. The corporation was a front, a money laundering operation run by two prominent local businessmen, both with deep ties to the city council and the mayor's office. They were the men from Sarah's drawings. For years, they had partnered with Blackwood, fencing the stolen donations through their network of retail contacts and offshore accounts, generating millions in untaxed profits. A portion of that money was funneled back into political campaigns and, quote, charitable donations, ensuring that any official oversight of Blackwood Pines was either cursory or conducted by friendly auditors who knew exactly where not to look. The embezzlement was not just a crime, it was a pillar of the city's corrupt political machine. A sickening realization dawned on Detective Miller. The reason the original 1995 investigation had been so swiftly and decisively shut down wasn't just due to Blackwood's influence. It was a coordinated effort by his powerful partners to protect their shared criminal enterprise. The disappearance of 3 orphans was a loose end that could have unraveled everything. By pushing the runaway narrative and applying pressure through their political contacts, they ensured that no one would dig too deep. The case was closed, not out of incompetence, but by design. The girls were not just victims of a single monstrous man. They were casualties of a systemic corruption that had poisoned the city's leadership, a system that valued profit and power far more than the lives of 3 vulnerable children. The story, now leaked to a hungry press, exploded into a citywide scandal. It was no longer a tragic cold case. It was a story of systemic corruption, political kickbacks, and the murder of child witnesses. News vans camped outside the gates of Blackwood Pines, their satellite dishes pointed at the building like accusations. The names of the 2 businessmen were splashed across the front page, leading to a firestorm at City Hall. Catherine found herself in an impossible position, trying to shield the home's current residents from the toxic fallout of its past, while simultaneously being hailed as a hero by some and a reckless troublemaker by others. The quiet search for justice had become a loud, public spectacle that threatened to consume everyone involved. Miller brought Arthur Blackwood in for a final interrogation. The old man was still the picture of indignant denial, his posture rigid with arrogance. But Miller didn't ask a single question about the girls. Instead, he calmly laid out the evidence of the conspiracy on the table: the Phoenix Distribution financial ledgers, the warehouse manifests, bank statements detailing offshore transfers, and, finally, a large, clear photograph of Sarah's drawing of the Phoenix logo. Blackwood stared at the evidence, his face slowly draining of color. His cold, calculating mind processed the irrefutable proof not of his cruelty, but of his financial ruin. It was in that moment that his composure finally shattered. The monster was real, but his greatest fear wasn't being seen as a murderer. It was being seen as a failure. The stakes had escalated beyond anything Catherine or Miller could have anticipated. The simple, righteous quest for justice for Emily, Sarah, and Jessica had disturbed a hornet's nest of entrenched power. Miller began receiving quiet suggestions from his superiors to focus solely on Blackwood and let the business side of things be handled by the Financial Crimes Unit, a clear signal to back off. Catherine started receiving anonymous, vaguely threatening phone calls at the home, telling her she had done enough and that some things are better left buried. They had not just solved a murder, they had declared war on a corrupt and powerful network. And that network was now beginning to fight back with the silent, menacing pressure that had kept its secrets safe for more than a decade. The interrogation room at the precinct was a sterile, soundless box, smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was in this suffocating quiet that George, the custodian, finally broke. He sat hunched over the small metal table, a man hollowed out by a decade of silence, his body a fragile vessel for a grief too immense to contain. Opposite him, Detective Miller and Catherine sat not as accusers, but as witnesses to a soul's final, agonizing unraveling. Between them, like a sacred text, lay Sarah's sketchbook, its pages open to a drawing of 3 smiling girls. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the ghosts that had been summoned. George's first uttered word was a dry, rasping sob, the sound of a lock rusting open after years of disuse, and the dam of his memory finally burst. He began not on the night of the disappearance, but a week before. He described a chilling encounter with Arthur Blackwood in the boiler room, the same place Catherine had first confronted him. Blackwood, with his usual icy calm, had mentioned George's fondness for the little trio, his words laced with a veiled threat that was as sharp as a shard of glass. He had found Sarah's sketchbook left behind in the library. He knew they were watching him. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing for children in a place like this, George," Blackwood had said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "It can lead them into dark places. It is our job to protect them from such things." In that moment, George understood it was not a warning about the girls' safety, but a command for his own. The plan Blackwood laid out was presented as a cruel but necessary lesson. He framed it as a theatrical deterrent, a way to scare the girls out of their dangerous fantasies of being detectives. He would use their own game, their belief in a secret exit, against them. He told George they would play a special game of hide-and-seek, luring them into the hidden passage. He would lock the door, leave them in the dark for an hour, just long enough to terrify them into silence, and then let them out. They need to understand that some doors should never be opened, Blackwood had explained, his logic a twisted parody of paternal concern. George's role was simple: ensure the main attic door was accessible, and then, afterward, help stage the runaway scene to complete the lesson. George's confession was punctuated by ragged, desperate breaths as he recounted his own cowardice. He knew it was monstrous, a violation of the trust the girls had placed in him. But Blackwood's power was absolute. He had threatened George, not with violence, but with something far worse: total annihilation. He spoke of George's meager pension, the roof over his head, the simple, anonymous life he clung to. Blackwood could erase him with a single phone call, label him a thief or something worse, and cast him out into a world that had no place for an old, broken man. The crisp envelope with $500 in cash that Blackwood slid into his hand wasn't a bribe. It was a leash, a cold, transactional chain that bound his conscience to Blackwood's will. He took the money, and in doing so, he sold his soul. The final night replayed in his memory with excruciating, vivid detail. He saw the girls slipping up the stairs to the third floor, their faces glowing with a mixture of fear and defiant excitement. Jessica had turned and given him a final, conspiratorial wave, her precious rag doll tucked securely under her arm. He could still feel the cold, heavy iron of the attic key in his hand, the key he had been ordered to leave in the lock. His heart had hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He had a choice. He could have screamed, run to another staff member, thrown the key away. But he did nothing. He watched them go, their whispered giggles echoing in the hallway, and then he turned and walked away, the weight of his betrayal a physical stone in his gut. From the bottom of the attic stairs, hidden in the shadows of the third-floor landing, he listened. He heard Blackwood's voice, a smooth, treacherous river of sound, calm and reassuring. "A new game," he heard the director say, his tone that of a benevolent father figure. "A special secret just for the three of you." George could picture the scene in his mind. Blackwood, leading them to the far wall, his hand resting paternally on Emily's shoulder as he revealed the hidden door. He heard their small gasps of wonder, the nervous excitement as they stepped into the darkness, believing they were on the cusp of their greatest adventure. They were not afraid of him. In their world of make-believe heroes and villains, they had tragically miscast the monster standing right beside them. Then came the sound. A solid, definitive cald of heavy wood meeting its frame, followed by the metallic scrape and final, sickening click of the bolt being shot home. It was a sound of absolute finality, a sound that had sliced through the silence of the attic and embedded itself in George's memory forever. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a single, confused question from inside the wall, Jessica's voice, small and thin. "Mr. Blackwood?" It was followed by a frantic, desperate rattling of the door from the inside. The game was over. The reality had begun. Their childish adventure had just transformed into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. The girls' initial cries were of confusion, then of rising panic. Their small fists pounded against the solid wood, their voices pleading, begging to be let out. George stood frozen in the shadows, his entire body trembling, every instinct screaming at him to run up the stairs and tear the door open. But he could see Blackwood's silhouette at the top of the landing, a dark, motionless sentinel of evil. The director just stood there, listening to the sounds of their terror with an unnerving, placid stillness. He didn't move until their cries began to soften into desperate, exhausted sobs. Only then did he turn, his face in the dim light a mask of cold satisfaction. He walked past George without a word, the architect of a perfect crime leaving his masterpiece to its slow, silent completion. Catherine listened, her face pale and rigid, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. The clinical horror of the forensic report was gone. replaced by an intimate, unbearable vision of the girls' final moments. She could feel their terror, their suffocating darkness, their dawning, horrific realization that no one was coming. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and silent, a testament to the grief she felt for the children she had never known, but now loved with a fierce, protective sorrow. She reached out, and her fingers gently touched the yarn hair of the rag doll on the table. It was no longer an object of evidence. It was a relic, a sacred witness to their last, terrified heartbeats, and she held on to it, as if it could somehow channel her strength back through time to them. George's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper as he described the days that followed. He confessed that he had heard them. For the first 2 days he could hear faint scratching sounds from the attic, the desperate, hopeless noise of small fingernails against solid wood. He heard their voices, growing weaker and weaker, until they were just faint, intermittent whimpers that the old building's groans almost swallowed. He started taking the long way around the building to avoid the 3rd floor, but the sounds were in his head, a constant, ghostly chorus of accusation. He saw their faces in every child in the dining hall, heard their laughter in the empty hallways. The home had become his own personal hell, and he was its silent, tormented keeper. Detective Miller's face was a mask of granite, but a muscle twitched violently in his jaw. For 10 years, this case had been a ghost in his career, a failure that sat like a stone in his gut. He had let Blackwood's smooth, authoritative lies and the pressure from his superiors cloud his own instincts. He had looked at the staged scene, the open window, the knotted sheets, and accepted the convenient narrative. Now, hearing the truth, the raw, unvarnished evil of it, filled him with a cold, clarifying rage. He felt a profound, personal shame for his role in allowing this lie to stand for a decade, for letting these girls remain lost in a file cabinet while their killer walked free, cloaked in respectability. The confession hung in the air, a toxic, shimmering cloud of truth. George was now weeping uncontrollably, his body racked with the dry, heaving sobs of a man who had lost everything, most of all himself. He had confessed not just to his complicity, but to the unforgivable sin of his inaction. He was a coward who had stood by while innocence was entombed. But his confession, born of a decade of torment, had finally given the girls their voice back. It was the key, the final, irrefutable piece of evidence that transformed Arthur Blackwood from a person of interest into a monster who had meticulously planned and executed the murder of 3 small children to protect his greed. Miller didn't look at George. He didn't look at Catherine. His gaze was fixed on the far wall of the sterile room, but he was seeing the face of Arthur Blackwood, the cold arrogance, the chilling detachment. The time for questions, for doubts, for procedure was over. There was only the hunt now, the final righteous act of bringing a predator to justice. He picked up the police radio from his belt, his movements economical and precise. He pressed the button, and his voice cut through the silence of the room, devoid of all emotion, hard and final as a coffin nail. "All units," he said, his words clear and steady. "We have a confirmed location on the suspect, Arthur Blackwood. Move in. Now." The tactical police units descended upon the Serenity Meadows retirement villa with a silent, lethal efficiency that was a brutal counterpoint to the manicured lawns and tranquil fountains. Arthur Blackwood was in the community greenhouse, tending to his prized orchids, when 2 plainclothes officers approached him. His reaction was not one of fear or surprise, but of profound, aristocratic indignation. He looked at the warrant in Detective Miller's steady hand as if it were a piece of trash. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his withered wrists, his face remained a mask of contemptuous disbelief. He didn't see a murderer being brought to justice. He saw a gentleman of stature being accosted by ruffians. The residents watched from their windows, their placid afternoon shattered by the sight of the man they knew as a quiet gardener being led away, his legacy of civic duty revealed as a carefully constructed lie over a pit of unimaginable evil. The arrest detonated a media bomb that shook the city to its core. The story of the Blackwood butcher and the attic tomb. was a sensationalist firestorm, dominating every news cycle. The gates of Blackwood Pines became a permanent encampment for reporters and camera crews, their lenses capturing the grim facade of the building where a monstrous crime had been allowed to fester for a decade. The public's reaction was a tidal wave of horror and rage, directed not only at Blackwood but at the entire system that had failed to protect the three young girls. For Catherine, the home transformed from a sanctuary into a fishbowl. She spent her days shielding the current children from the lurid headlines, and her nights fielding calls from outraged parents and panicked board members, fighting to keep the institution from collapsing under the weight of its own dark history. George, the custodian's fate, was a quieter, though no less profound, tragedy. Charged as an accessory to murder, his case became a footnote in the larger, more sensational trial of Arthur Blackwood. His full, tearful confession, corroborated by evidence of Blackwood's long-standing psychological manipulation and financial coercion, painted a picture not of a co-conspirator, but of a broken man trapped by fear. The prosecution, acknowledging his pivotal role in securing Blackwood's conviction, offered a plea deal. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with parole possible after 2. But the legal sentence was meaningless. His true punishment was the life sentence of guilt he had already been serving for 10 years, a torment that would follow him long after he was released, haunted by the memory of 3 small voices he had failed to answer. His final apology in court was not to the judge, but to the empty space where he imagined the girls were listening. Arthur Blackwood's trial was a piece of high-stakes legal theater. The prosecution, armed with an arsenal of irrefutable evidence, constructed a narrative of pure, calculated evil. They presented Sarah's innocent sketchbook as the damning proof of a motive rooted in greed. The locksmith's expert testimony transformed the hidden passage from a whimsical secret into a purpose-built death trap. Financial records from Phoenix Distribution laid bare the vast criminal conspiracy Blackwood had killed to protect. But the trial's emotional climax was George's testimony. On the stand, he was a ghost, his voice barely a whisper as he recounted the final, terrifying sounds from behind the wall. The confused pleas, the frantic pounding, and then the slow, agonizing descent into silence. The courtroom was utterly still, the jury's faces a mixture of horror and pity, as he described the sound of the bolts sliding home. The defense fought back with the only strategy they had, character assassination. They portrayed Blackwood as a respected community leader, a benevolent patriarch who had dedicated his life to underprivileged children. They painted George as a disgruntled, mentally unstable employee with a long-standing grudge, his confession a desperate, fantastical bid for attention. They described the 3 girls as troubled, rebellious delinquents, known for their elaborate and dangerous games, suggesting they had accidentally trapped themselves in a tragic misadventure. Throughout it all, Arthur Blackwood sat at the defense table, immaculate in his tailored suit, his expression one of bored indifference. He was a portrait of untouchable arrogance, a man who believed himself so far above the proceedings that the truth itself was merely an inconvenience to be managed. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 4 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were grim and resolute. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, stood and read the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. On the charge of the murder of Emily Davis, we, the jury, find the defendant, Arthur Blackwood, guilty. The word echoed through the silent room, followed by 2 more identical pronouncements for Sarah Peterson and Jessica Miller. As the third guilty was read, Blackwood's mask of detached composure finally cracked. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, cold and reptilian, locked onto Catherine and Detective Miller. For a fleeting second, they saw not a frail old man, but the unadulterated, venomous rage of a predator that had been cornered and exposed. It was the face of pure, unrepentant evil. The sentencing was a formality. Arthur Blackwood received 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each life he had so callously extinguished, with no possibility of parole. He would die within the cold, institutional walls of a maximum security prison, a fate that was a grim echo of the one he had imposed upon his victims. The fallout from the trial cascaded through the city's corrupt network. The two businessmen behind Phoenix Distribution were convicted on a host of federal charges, their empires of influence and wealth crumbling into dust. The scandal triggered a wave of resignations at City Hall and led to a sweeping federal investigation into municipal corruption. The silence of 3 murdered children had, in the end, become a roar that tore down an entire edifice of greed and deceit, a testament to the fact that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, can be kept forever. In the quiet aftermath, Catherine walked through the halls of Blackwood Pines, a building now exorcised of its darkest ghost. The adrenaline of the investigation and the trial had subsided, leaving behind a profound, aching sorrow for the childhoods that had been stolen. The attic was no longer a place of horror. After being forensically cleared, she had it completely renovated, not into the playroom she had once envisioned, but into a quiet, sunlit library and memorial. A large bay window now overlooked the gardens, flooding the space with light. She had fulfilled her promise, had given the girls the justice they were denied, but the victory felt hollow. It was a peace earned at an unbearable cost, a resolution that could never bring back the sound of their laughter in the hallways. Detective Miller visited her one last time before his retirement papers were finalized. He looked older, but the deep lines of regret around his eyes seemed to have softened. The verdict was his redemption, the closing of a wound that had festered for a decade. He handed her a thin, worn manila folder. It was his original 1995 case file on the girl's disappearance. "I think they'd want you to have this," he said simply. "You were the one who really listened." They stood in silence in her office, two unlikely allies, bound by a shared duty to the past. He was finally free to leave the ghosts of his career behind, knowing that the story of Emily, Sarah, and Jessica was now in the hands of someone who would ensure they were never forgotten again. The tragedy of Blackwood Pines became a powerful catalyst for change. The public outcry was so immense that it forced a complete, top-to-bottom overhaul of the state's child welfare system. New legislation, officially named the Emily, Sarah, and Jessica Act, was passed, mandating stricter oversight, independent audits of all children's homes, and the establishment of a confidential whistleblower hotline for both staff and residents. Their names, once lost in a dusty cold case file, were now etched into law, a permanent legacy of reform born from an unspeakable crime. They had been silenced in the most brutal way imaginable, but their story had given a powerful new voice to thousands of other vulnerable children, ensuring that the institutional neglect that allowed their killer to flourish would never happen again. Inside the new memorial library in the attic, Catherine created a special place of honor. In a simple, elegant glass display case, she placed the items that had brought the truth to light. At the center was Sarah's worn sketchbook, open to a drawing of 3 girls holding hands. Beside it lay the small, heart-shaped locket that had belonged to Jessica. And next to that, sitting on a small velvet cushion, was the rag doll. Its one button eye no longer seemed to hold a desperate secret, but a look of quiet, peaceful vigilance. The doll, once a forgotten object in a dusty corner, had become a sacred relic, a testament to a bond that could not be broken, a symbol of a truth that had refused to stay buried, and a reminder that even in the darkest of places, love endures. One bright spring afternoon, months after the trial had ended, Catherine was shelving books in the attic library when a young girl, about 8 years old, approached the display case. "Who are they?" she asked, pointing to the framed photograph of Emily, Sarah, and Jessica that Catherine had placed next to the doll. Catherine knelt down beside her and, for the first time, told their story, without the shadow of the investigation looming over it. She spoke not of murder or a monster, but of 3 brave, inseparable friends who loved each other, who played incredible games, and who discovered a terrible secret because they were smart and courageous. She told the little girl that they were heroes. In that moment, the cycle of silence and fear that had defined Blackwood Pines was finally, irrevocably broken, replaced by a legacy of remembrance and strength. The resolution was absolute, a definitive closing of a dark and painful chapter. The questions that had hung in the stale attic air had all been answered. The monster who had walked the halls cloaked in respectability was now caged in darkness. The corrupt system he had exploited was dismantled, and the institutional silence had been replaced by a chorus of reform. Justice, in its slow, grinding way, had finally been served. But the true resolution was quieter. It was found in the light that now filled the attic, in the name of a law that protected other children, and in the enduring story of 3 little girls whose friendship proved to be more powerful than the monster who tried to erase them. Their lives had been tragically short, but their echo would now resonate for generations. The attic is quiet now. The ghosts that once haunted its dusty corners have been replaced by the soft rustle of turning pages and the gentle hum of afternoon sunlight pouring through the new bay window. It is no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary, a library filled not with forgotten ledgers, but with stories of adventure, magic, and hope. Catherine often finds herself here, watching the current generation of children read in the very spot where 3 others had their futures stolen from them. The transformation is a testament to her unwavering belief that a place, like a person, can be redeemed. Blackwood Pines is no longer defined by the darkness it once concealed, but by the light it now actively cultivates. The building itself seems to breathe easier, its old timbers finally unburdened by the weight of a decade-long suffocating secret. Justice, Catherine has learned, is a complex and often unsatisfying concept. Arthur Blackwood will spend the remainder of his life in a concrete cell, a fitting symmetry for the fate he designed for his victims. His corrupt network has been dismantled, its powerful members brought low by the testimony of a child's sketchbook. These are tangible, legal victories, the kind that fill newspapers and close case files. But they do not bring back the sound of Emily's quiet confidence, Sarah's focused sketching, or Jessica's infectious laughter. The true justice, the only kind that truly matters, is found not in a courtroom verdict, but in the act of remembrance. It is the quiet, daily work of ensuring that their names are spoken, their story is told, and their legacy becomes a permanent shield for those who come after them. In the center of the library, the glass display case stands as the story's final chapter. The doll, with its single button eye, sits on a velvet cushion, its watch finally over. It is no longer a vessel for a hidden map, but a monument to an unbreakable bond. Beside it, Sarah's sketchbook is open to a page showing 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun, a heartbreaking testament to their innocent dreams. And next to that, Jessica's small, heart-shaped locket, polished and gleaming, reflects the light. These are not just artifacts from a crime scene. They are relics of a childhood, sacred objects that survive the darkness. They are the physical proof that even when a voice is silenced, the truth it holds can find a way to endure, waiting patiently for the right hands to finally set it free. The journey has left an indelible mark on Catherine. She came to Blackwood Pines as a reformer, an administrator with plans for budgets and structural improvements. She will leave, whenever that day comes, as a guardian of memory. The ghosts of Emily, Sarah, and Jessica are no longer specters of horror, but quiet companions in her work. They are in the fierce protectiveness she feels for every child under her care, in the intolerance she now has for bureaucratic indifference, and in the profound understanding that her job is not merely to manage an institution, but to nurture the fragile lives within it. She solved their murder, but in doing so, they solved a fundamental question for her. The true measure of a life is not in its duration, but in the impact it leaves on the world, no matter how small or how brief. The ripples of their story spread far beyond the iron gates of Blackwood Pines. The Emily, Sarah, and Jessica Act became a landmark piece of legislation, a firewall of accountability built from the ashes of their tragedy. It forced a reckoning within a system that had long prioritized reputation over responsibility. Their names, once symbols of a cold case, are now synonymous with reform, spoken in state houses and social work seminars, as a permanent reminder of the cost of institutional silence. Their lives were cruelly cut short, but their deaths ignited a revolution in child welfare, creating a legacy of protection that now extends to thousands of children they would never meet. In the end, the three small girls who were deemed disposable by a powerful man became the force that dismantled his world and built a better one in its place. In the town, the story has become a somber legend, a cautionary tale whispered among generations. The children of Blackwood Pines are no longer seen with pity or suspicion, but with a new sense of community vigilance. Every year, on the anniversary of the day the girls were found, a small, informal memorial is held at the gates of the home. Townspeople leave flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten notes. They are no longer the runaway girls or the attic victims. They are Emily, Sarah, and Jessica. They have been given back their names, their identities, and their place in the town's collective heart. The story has taught the community a hard and painful lesson, that the most monstrous things often happen not in the shadows, but in the quiet, respectable places where no one is willing to look too closely. Detective Miller enjoys his retirement. He spends his mornings fishing at a quiet lake, the ghosts of his past finally laid to rest. The Blackwood case was the last entry in his service record, a final, definitive victory that overshadowed a career's worth of smaller regrets. He knows he didn't solve it alone. It was a chain of courage that began with three brave little girls, was carried for a decade by a forgotten doll, and was finally ignited by a director who refused to let the past remain buried. He found redemption not in the act of snapping handcuffs on an old man's wrists, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find its champion. He helped close a chapter of darkness, and in doing so, he was finally able to turn the page on his own. The story of Blackwood Pines is a stark reminder that the fight for justice is often a long and lonely one, but its impact can change the world. The courage of three small girls and one determined woman brought down a corrupt system, but their story is just one of many that remain hidden in the shadows, waiting for a voice. What other secrets are locked away in the forgotten corners of our own communities? The battle against institutional silence is never truly over. And this was only the beginning of something much bigger. We want to continue bringing you stories that matter, stories that give a voice to the voiceless. If you believe in this mission, please consider supporting our channel. Your engagement helps us ensure that no story and no victim is ever truly forgotten. In the end, it was the doll that waited. It waited through 10 years of suffocating silence, a silent sentinel in a forgotten corner, holding a story that refused to die. It teaches us that evil thrives in the quiet complicity of good people. But it also teaches us that the smallest voice, even one stitched from thread and cloth, can be enough to tear down an empire of lies. The legacy of Blackwood Pines is not one of horror, but of hope. It is a testament to the enduring power of friendship, the fierce resilience of the human spirit, and the simple, profound truth that no wall is thick enough, no lock is strong enough, and no amount of time is long enough to bury a story that needs to be told. The question it leaves behind is not for them, but for us. When we hear the faint scratching from behind the wall, will we have the courage to listen?